Gentlemen, a couple disclaimers. This is probably going to be a terrible video for a couple of reasons. Number one, this chapter is, out of all 16 chapters in the textbook, this particular chapter is less in my wheelhouse than any of the others. I simply just don't use this information. I've never really used it since grad school. All the other stuff you kind of can apply to daily life. This whole chapter is on parts of the brain and kind of what they do and neurological function, and I just simply have never used it. So this is all straight theory. I can't bring any experience to the table to bolster this chapter. So it's just not my favorite. Secondly, just FYI, I work a 12-hour shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. At Amazon warehouse. I got tired of sitting around all the time, and now all this stuff is online, so I thought, I need to get out, do something. So there's some management positions there, but I didn't know that managers have to do like manual labor. I have to like unload pallets and stuff. So it's pretty tiring, and I'm going on about 3 hours sleep right now. So I wasn't planning on doing a video today, but the faster I get it done, the sooner all these videos are done, and they're just there, right? I don't have to worry about it anymore. And B, I happen to have the house to myself. So it's always weird to do videos like this when there's people in the background. It makes me feel self-conscious. So anyways, without further ado, let's get this chapter knocked out. I promise it'll be shorter, and I promise it's the last crappy chapter. Everything after this, I think, gets more interesting and kind of more fun. So, biology and behavior. All right. So first we're going to talk quickly about different ways to, oh, by the way, I've done absolutely no prep. So this is what I say is what happens. I usually go through the PowerPoint a little bit. I'm too tired for all that. So I'm just going to look at it. I haven't seen this stuff in 6 months, and we'll see what jogs the memory. All right. So anyways, couple different ways that science can kind of play around with measuring different things in the brain. One of them is an EEG, which I'm sure you've heard of. It stands for electroencephalogram, and it is a record of brainwave activity. So they put all these little electrodes all over the place. They're super duper sensitive. They can detect very, very small amounts of electrical activity, and it puts all that together in an EEG. So that's one. A CAT scan, or also a CT scan. It's the same thing. It stands for computerized axial tomography. It's a brain scanning technique that utilizes a rotating computerized X-ray tube that produces cross-sectional images of the structures of the brain. So that's the important part there. It's looking at the structure. So if you get into a car wreck and you don't have your seatbelt on, your head hits the windshield, first thing the doctor's going to do is say, give me a CT scan or give me a CAT scan. However that particular doctor chooses to say that. I can get my Captain America stuff. By the way, isn't all my Captain America stuff pretty cool, right? It's all kind of jumbled around on the floor because I don't know where to put it, but like I have a lot of Captain America stuff, so I'm a little bit of a fan. Anyways, okay, see, I can't even focus. Oh my god, this video is going to be terrible. So yeah, the doctor's going to offer or ask for a CT scan or a CAT scan because he wants to know if there's been any damage to the structure of your brain. Next is MRI. Funny thing, on my HCC classes that I used to teach, they had a departmental final. So I didn't write it, the department did. I had to give their test, which I didn't like. But one of the questions was, which of the measurement devices utilizes magnets or something like that? And it was CT scan, PET scan, MRI, or EEG. It was alarming the number of people that didn't get that question right. I mean, MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And you might not know that, but I just feel like that was such an easy question. It's got an M in it, and there's CT scan, PET scan, EEG. There's no M in any of those acronyms whatsoever. So even if you don't know it, I just would think common sense would let you know magnetic resonance imaging. If you even kind of paid attention you would get that right. So many people miss that question. So weird. So anyway, so don't be an HCC student. Y'all are better than that. MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. It's a diagnostic scanning technique that produces high-resolution images of the structure of the brain. So the difference there being, these are high-resolution. CAT scan, not so much. It's more like an X-ray. So we're going from an X-ray, it's kind of going from standard definition to like 4D kind of, that's how big of a leap it is. So why don't they always just do an MRI? When you get into that car wreck, you didn't have your seatbelt on, head hits the windshield, the doctor doesn't say, hey, go get an MRI. He does sometimes, but why don't they go to that first, do you think? Because CT scans are quicker and cheaper. Most hospitals have CT scans. Many of them have MRIs, but they are just much, much more expensive. Some of them don't have it. You have to go outside of the hospital to get an MRI. So it's not the first choice because it's more expensive. Next is a PET scan. PET scan stands for positron emission tomography. It's a brain imaging technique that reveals activity in various parts of the brain based on patterns of blood flow, oxygen use, and glucose consumption. So the way that works is they give you a solution that's mildly irradiated. You take that and then you get under the machine, and the machine looks for the liquid that you drank, which is mixed with a lot of glucose. Glucose goes to the brain. So they're measuring, they can see the isotopes in the radioactive drink that they make you drink. And so they can track that. And by doing so, they can see what parts of your brain become active. So PET scans, another one. And then the last one is an fMRI. Now, an fMRI is just a functional MRI. It's a slightly bolstered piece of equipment that looks at both structure and brain activity, and it's more precise than a PET scan, and it's more high resolution than a regular MRI. It's just the Cadillac of MRI stuff. So that is a couple of the devices that are used to measure brain activity. So let's talk about the most important 3 pounds of your body. And that's brains. I don't know what you thought I meant by that, but I was talking about your brain. Your brain's about 3 pounds. So, most important part of your body is your brain. Why? Because it pretty much controls everything you do, say, and who you are. Hang on. See? This is what happens when you record live. Recording. Sorry. Okay, so, terminology. Basically, 80% of this chapter is just nomenclature. This is called this, and this does that, right? That's why I don't really like this chapter, because I like theory, more abstract stuff. And the big thing about studying the brain that, I don't say bothers me, but just it's not my favorite thing, is I'm a very neat, orderly person. I like to have things, ducks in a row kind of thing. I like black and white. I don't like gray, unless I'm trying to figure out something that's not black and white. And then that's a little different. But by and large, I want, dogs to bark and cats to meow and, birds to chirp. I just want there to be like rhyme and reason and order to things, right? So the thing I don't like about studying the brain is that you talk about this part of the brain does these things, right? And then this part of the brain does these things. But then you look at the fine print and it's like, well, okay, unless something happened to this part of the brain and it can't do that stuff anymore, and then this part of the brain can do it. Or this part of the brain does this, but this part does it sometimes. Or it does it to a lesser extent. It's like, oh my God, where is memory in the brain? Period. Just answer me that. You don't get a straight answer. It's not this. It's this part, but then this part of the memory is a little bit this part of the brain, and then so I just don't like the how everything is spread out like that. So I'm telling you that because don't so much worry about I'm not going to ask a question on the exam like what part of the brain controls all of your memory. They'll be very broad questions. Okay, so just get the very basic, zoomed out approach to this chapter, and don't spend tons and tons of time memorizing all those different parts of the brains and every single thing that that part of the brain does. Okay, it's going to be a huge waste of your time, and I don't want to do that. So many of you are probably nursing students. I get a lot of nursing students because it's popular at Lone Star, and this is a prereq for that. And you will go on and take anatomy and physiology. By the way, don't underestimate that class. I've actually taken it at Lone Star, and it'll kick you in the pants. It's a lot of stuff to remember, and it's a lot of studying. So it's not hard, but it's just a lot of information, even though it's broken down AMP1 and AMP2. And by the way, AMP2 is exponentially more difficult than 1 because 1 is stuff you kind of know, bones, nerves, muscles. You know, we've all heard of most of that stuff. AMP2 gets into like the deep inside things that are going on, and it's a little more involved. You don't know that stuff already unless you've taken like high level biology classes in high school maybe. So anyways, so you'll learn all this stuff whenever you take AMP. I'm not worried about that. And for the rest of us that aren't going into a medical field, you're never going to use this stuff anyway. All right, so cerebrum and cerebral cortex. So the cerebrum is all of this. It's the totality of the brain. Doctors don't say, yeah, you got an injury to your brain. It doesn't sound doctorly, right? So they use big fancy words like cerebrum. So when they say cerebrum, it's essentially the same thing as saying brain. It's everything, right? They're not indicating any one particular part. Now, if they said cerebral cortex, now they're talking the surface of your brain, right? Not something deep down inside, all the little things that are inside your brain. They're talking about just the outside surface, that part that you can see easily, all right? Now, we all know what a brain looks like, right? It's got all these weird, bumps and grooves and ridges. Well, those have names. And the bumps part, the parts that protrude, or the folds, or the bumps, or however you want to put it, these are called the gyri, or the gyrus, depending on if you're talking singular or plural. And then the lines, or the fissures that are here, the grooves, are called sulci. Sulci, if it's collectively, like all of the sulci of your brain. If it's this one particular part, then we would call it a sulcus. So that's the singular way to say that. Now you'll see this is the top view of a brain. This would be the front of the brain. So like your eyes would be up here looking this direction, and this would be the back of your head, and we're looking down from the top. This split right down the middle that separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere is called the longitudinal fissure. So remember geography, you have latitude and longitude, right? So latitude, I always remember fat, that's wide. So if that's going left and right. If you're going up and down, that's long. So this is the longitudinal fissure. Those are the type of questions that you might see, something kind of basic like that, all right? Another angle, so this would be the front of the brain looking this direction, right? This would be the back of the brain. So we're looking at the entire brain, and it's facing this direction, right? Looking at me. Different lobes, right? So the brain is separated into 4 large areas called lobes. And they're pretty easy to remember, so this is probably something that you would see. The front part is called the frontal lobe. And if you miss that, you probably don't have this organ. All right, on the side here, this would be your temporal lobe, right? It's labeled right here. Temporal lobes. So your temples are right here. Your temporal lobe is on that side, right? And it's named that because it's this is where your auditory functions are. Temples, ears, real close together. Now, the back of your brain is called your occipital lobe. Occipital meaning ocular, meaning vision. This is where your visual cortex is located. And the way that I remember that is I read about the sad story of, I don't remember who it was, somebody very well known, an athlete or something, and they asked him like what his biggest regret was, and he said that he has basically kind of PTSD because when he was a kid, he was at a birthday party and they had a piñata, and he had the stick, and it was a pretty heavy stick, and he went to take a swing, and when he swung, somebody stepped in front of him, another child stepped in front of him, and he hit that kid in the back of the head. And when he hit that kid in the back of the head, it knocked them out. And when they woke up, they were blind, and they never regained their vision. And he always felt guilty that he had done that. And I remember the first time I heard that story, I thought, why would getting hit in the back of your head make your eyes not work? They're in the front of your head. It didn't make any sense to me. Well, the reason is the back of your brain is where your occipital lobe is. That's what controls your vision. So if I'm trying to remember what part of the brain controls vision, don't confuse it with frontal lobe because that's closest to your eyes. If you were to dissect the brain and look at it and you see your ocular nerves and how they come out and they zigzag and they go to the back, they connect back here. All right, so your occipital lobe controls your vision, so ocular, easy to remember. And then that leaves this area right here. If you were Jewish and you wore a yarmulke, it would be like right up here on the top of your head. This is your parietal lobe. That's what that's called. Now you'll notice, so this is that longitudinal fissure, right, which we can't see in this angle, right, but it would be going this direction. Now, going the other direction, instead of calling this like the latitudinal, which would make sense because we have longitudinal and latitudinal, right, they didn't do that. They went central. So this is called the central sulcus. The central sulcus is this part in the middle. And we'll kind of come back. We have a precentral and a postcentral. You don't really need to know that. There's another slide later that kind of talks about why these are highlighted into two different things. It does some stuff, but we'll get to that in a minute. So just remember from this frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and parietal lobe. Okay. This is the same exact view, but split in half. Okay. So now we're not looking at like the left side of the brain as in the previous slide. This is actually looking directly in the middle of the brain. So you can see some of the inner workings in here. I didn't mention this before. This is the cerebellum. You can see in this picture right here. It looks like a miniature brain coming off of the bottom of the big brain. And that's why it's named that. Actually, is it on the next slide? Yeah. So the cerebellum is actually Latin for little brain. And that's kind of what it looks like. It looks like another little brain. It's essential for maintaining balance and motor coordination. Still a lot of unknowns, but its suspected ties to language, cognition, perception. See, this is what I don't like. We go from balance to thinking to perceiving to, I mean, there's so many different things. They're not even related, and they all happen in the cerebellum, but they also happen in other places. So it gets a little confusing. So just balance and motor coordination, this is pretty much primarily where that happens. So I think on the exam you'll probably see something about balance and motor coordination happens in the cerebellum. Now, don't confuse the terminologies. Cerebrum is whole brain, and cerebellum is this little component, right? So we have cerebrum and cerebellum. They're very similar sounding words, so they get confused quite often. So make sure you remember that cerebellum is the little brain part. All right, the medulla or medulla oblongata, which is Adam Sandler's favorite part of the brain because he mentions it in most of his movies. That is managing your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure. If you notice, it's like all of the mechanical things that happen in your body, right? Breathing, your ABCs. This is happening essentially in your medulla, but again, there's exceptions to that. There are other parts of your brain actually help out with that as well. And it pretty much connects the brain to the body. Now, you know, an anatomy professor would disagree with that because the way everything is put together, so it gets very technical, but for our purposes, it's suffice to say, it pretty much connects the brain to your body. The pons, or the pons viroli, by the way, if I keep looking over there, it's because I have a window there, and anytime a car drives by, it's just like, who's here? Somebody here? I don't want to seem paranoid, but it's just, oh, human beings. Oh, never mind, they're just driving by. All right, so the pons. Pons means bridge in Latin. You can see where this is. This is sort of the bridge between this part of your brain and this part of your brain. So we have this part of your brain that's helping you stay upright, this part of your brain that's kind of helping you breathe and heart go and all that kind of stuff. But then you got this part of your brain that's thinking, and you got memories, you got all these other things. The pons is kind of the middleman for all of this kind of stuff, right? So it has to do with the management of sleep, arousal, facial expressions. By the way, this term arousal, because I know what you're thinking, it's not that kind of arousal, right? This kind of arousal is talking about being like awake and alert, things like that. There's another part of your brain, which we'll talk about right here, this reticular activating system. This is that part of your brain that says, it's time to go to sleep, and then later says, hey, let's wake up. So this is one of the things that part of the brain does. The pons sort of communicates impulses from the reticular activating system to the parts of your brain that are responsible for, say, opening your eyes and then perceiving whatever it is that you are seeing or hearing. We hear things while we sleep all the time, right? Car drives by, air conditioner kicks on and off. Things happen. We don't wake up, right? That's the reticular activating system in the pons that are getting that sensory input and deciding on a very, very low, battery saving because I'm sleeping kind of thing. That's not important. We don't need to wake up, right? So your brain is actually functioning. It is actually hearing and not seeing, but it's hearing, maybe sometimes smelling different things while you're sleeping, and it's deciding, is that important, right? And you'll know whenever you have kids, you become most people anyway, become a much lighter sleeper because as a new parent, you're like, oh my God, something's going to happen to my child. So whenever they whimper one time in the middle of the night, you could go from somebody that sleeps through train wrecks to having your first kid, especially if their bedroom is like across the house, like in my old house. Our bedroom was upstairs and my kids were downstairs. I hated that because it was so far away. They had to really make some noise for us to be able to even really hear it. So of course you had to get baby monitors and all that. But then, they flip over in their crib and make one little sound and you jump up and run. That's because your reticular activating system kind of goes on high alert. You have this need to be there for your child. So you all of a sudden you become a light sleeper. And you weren't that way before. So, we have a pug, right? I should get him and bring him up here. I'll introduce you to my dog another time. So, if he barks, I instantly wake up, and it just comes from, I guess, being a cop. And I know I worked a burglary task force for a long time, and if you got a dog, he will let you know that a burglar is there. So, I guess in my head, if my dog is barking at 2 a.m., it's because there's a prowler outside, and I'm already paranoid, okay, well, what window is he at, and all that, and it turns out it's a squirrel or whatever, and I can't seem to turn that off. But then it's interesting because my stepdaughter, who's 15, she's a fairly light sleeper, but the dog sleeps in her room at night, and he will be at her door barking his head off. And she'll never wake up. And I'll be like, God, it woke me up. I went upstairs and yelled at him to shut up, went back downstairs. You never woke up for any of that? She's like, no. Because I just know it's just him barking. It's no big deal. So it's interesting how your brain can perceive your surroundings during times of non-arousal and sort of let you know, do you need to wake up for that or do you not need to wake up for that? Most of the time it's right. In my case, it's wrong. My dumb brain won't turn off for a stupid pug barking. Let's see. So I got all that. Subcortical structures. Okay, this is just more definitions. The midbrain lies between the pons and the cerebral hemispheres. Don't worry about that. The reticular formation I just talked about. Talks about control of mood, arousal, and sleep. Runs the length of the brainstem from the upper medulla into the midbrain. That's kind of what I've been talking about. The thalamus is directly in the center of the brain. If you were to go straight in the center here and then straight center here, as central in the middle of the brain as you can get, you'll run into the thalamus. It's involved in the processing of sensory information, arousal, learning, and memory. So this little tiny piece of the brain does a lot of different stuff, right? It's got its hand in a lot of these different things. But again, that part of your brain doesn't do only that, and there are other parts of the brain that also have to deal with memory, like your hippocampus. Look at this, participates in memory. So does the thalamus. So we have a lot of sort of cross training going on. By the way, before I do the exam, I intend to put out a review. I say intend to give myself an out in case I don't, but I probably will. I usually do. In fact, I think I already have one made. So again, don't kill yourself studying all this stuff for like forever and ever and trying to memorize all of the stuff on these slides. I feel like it's a lot of information. I will let you know the things that you need to take a second look at, okay, when it comes to this memory stuff. All right, so the hypothalamus participates in the regulation of thirst, temperature, hunger, and there's the sexual desire part of the brain. It's the hypothalamus. And also aggression. Hippocampus participates in memory. There's a good story about that we'll talk about whenever we get to the chapter on memory, so I'm going to save that for later. The amygdala, I don't know why that's my favorite part of the brain. It's located in the temporal lobe, so it's kind of off to the side. And it's believed to participate in the emotional processing, specifically in fear. So I did a little bit of research when I was working for the government about fear, which makes sense, right? One of the things that we found in doing enhanced interrogation techniques is that everybody thinks that it's torture, right? Okay, well, how do you define the word torture? What does that even mean? So if you're talking about torture being pain compliance, hurting somebody, right? Hitting them until they talk, or making them do whatever it is that's painful, right? And there's a whole list of things I won't gore you out with, but what we have found, what research has found, what experience has shown, is that won't get good information. It won't get you good intelligence. Why? Because people will tell you whatever they think you want to hear just to make the pain stop. So they're going to say whatever it is that they think you need to hear, so that you'll stop hitting them. That's not what we're after. We're not after, fake stuff. We want real intelligence. So pain compliance is not a particularly effective interrogation technique. In another chapter, I'll tell you what is the best. So stick around in case you want to torture somebody. But one of the things that we looked at was fear. If people are afraid, do they tend to tell you the truth more, or do they tend to be more guarded? What do you think? I'm just kidding. I can't hear you. Yeah. So when people are afraid, they tend to sort of let their guard down to some extent, and they tend to volunteer information. So the trick is, how do you make somebody scared but not in pain, right? Threatening to put a hot stick in their eye or something like that, right? There's a fear of pain, right? So, you don't want them to call your bluff, and, they don't talk, but then you don't do that, and then they think, oh yeah, they're not serious. This is all, a ruse to get me to talk. So that, you can't afford that. So anything you threaten, you have to be willing to go through with. But threatening pain means you might have to go through with that, and we've already said you're not going to get your information. So creating fear and an emotional fear became kind of a paramount thing to study. Like, how do we do that, right? Like, what invokes fear in everybody, And most of the time, if somebody has a family, it's like, threatening, really the family, not them. And one of the nifty things that, by the way, some of this stuff is sort of, I'm not supposed to talk about, so, don't narc me out. But so let me talk hypothetically. Hypothetically speaking, let's just pretend that you have this terrorist and he's not talking, but he knows information that is, a coming attack or something, so people are going to die. And if you have this information, you can maybe prevent that. So over here, you have satellite imagery of his tiny little village that he lives in, right? What if you took CGI, right, which we can easily do, and CGI'd a drone strike, right? Hey, by the way, look, here's your village. and then you pick up a radio that's not real, it's not nobody on the other end, and you're like, Bravo 352, you're green light, whatever, say something that sounds intelligent, and then you see like destruction and chaos, and then you immediately turn it off, right? Because that's all CGI stuff. You don't want to figure that out. And then you're like, you gonna talk now? And he's like, I can't believe you just did that, right? So then you pull up another picture, and it's another village with other family members of his, and you pick up the radio, and you're like, you gonna talk? So now you have the fear, like, oh, I need to talk because I'm scared. I don't want him to do that. But you also have the fact that you just fake missiled the last target, and so now there's grief and fear, and they sort of cancel each other out because the person often, hypothetically speaking, if this were a real thing, because it's not, hypothetically speaking, they would look and they would be like so dejected, they would be so depressed. I can't believe I lost little whomever, I don't want to say any names to be stereotypical, but you say, I can't believe little Johnny just got blown up in front of my eyes and everything, and now they're threatening to blow up little Susie in this other village, and now that depression sort of cancels out the fear. So anyways, lots of interesting research about the amygdala and invoking fear, and how that interacts with other parts of the brain. So that's about the only thing in this entire chapter that I can bring any actual real life experience to. And then finally here, this last one, corpus callosum is the wide band of axons that connects the right and the left hemispheres. So two sides of your brain, which I talked about, the left side, the right side, right, they're connected through a kind of a network of nerves called the corpus callosum. All right, I think this has already been kind of covered, but here we have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe again. And this is that central sulcus that I mentioned. And on this slide, I can barely read that. It says primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. So the very back part of the frontal lobe that's directly in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex. And it, as it sounds, responsible for some of the most complex cognitive processes, right? And then this last part has to do with sensory stuff. But again, don't worry about that stuff. You're not going to see that on the test. So I just want to make sure that you know those lobes, because that's a really easy thing to learn and put on a test. All right, mentioned this a couple times. What is brain lateralization? So left brain, right brain. We've probably heard that before, like, oh, he's left-brained. Oh, I'm very right-brained, right? What does that mean? Well, the left part of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right part of your brain controls the left side of your body. Why? Because I guess when God was making us, he was drunk. I don't know. Maybe he has a really good sense of humor. Maybe there's some reason for it that we haven't figured out yet, but we don't really know. But the corpus callosum crosses, and left brain's controlling right side, right brain controlling left side. So you get a little bit discombobulated sometimes whenever we're looking at different parts of the brain and how they affect different parts of the body. But the left part of the brain, or the left hemisphere rather, controls movement and sensation of the right side of the body. I said that. It does these things: language, math, and logic. So when you say somebody's a left-brained person, that means they're very logical, they're very like by the numbers kind of thing, right? A right-brained person, by contrast, they're more creative, they're more kind of abstract, very musically inclined, they're good at reading maps, they're very intuitive, they're kind of in touch with their feelings, they're very visual type people. Is there truth to this? Not really. This is a little bit pop psychology that's based on some real psychology, but for the most part, this is pop psychology. Because language is primarily on the left side of your brain, but it's also on the right side of your brain. And if something happened, if you got whacked in the head on the left side, the right side of your brain would take a much more active role in language. So it's like the left side is better at it than the right side. So the right side's like, okay, yeah, you go ahead and do that. Like you're better at that. But then if the left side falls flat for whatever reason, then the right brain is like, all right, I guess I'll do it. Right? So it's not that it can't do it. It's just it doesn't very often, right? sometimes whenever you get really, really tired, as I am, or sometimes whenever you're inebriated, that means you're drunk, um, it starts to sort of shut down parts of the brain, right? Because it's shutting down because it needs sleep, or it's shutting down because there's alcohol involved. And so what you get is the other side of your brain picking up the slack, and it doesn't do as good of a job. So language for most people is on the left side of your brain. Language is shut down because you're drunk. So now when you talk like this, right? Because the right side of your brain is, this is not the only reason this happens, right? This is just a theory that contributes. But now the right side of the brain is trying to compensate and help out with language, but it's not particularly good at it. So you're going to stumble over words, you're going to slur, those kinds of things, right? All right, so I didn't mention this, but there is a little bit of research that links positive emotions with left brain more so, and more negative emotions with right brain, which is weird because when I think of like the musically inclined, intuitive, all that, I think of this happy-go-lucky, like hippie. I would think that would be positive. And when I think of the very logical and by the numbers, and, very kind of accountant type person, I think more of that's kind of negative, like that's boring, right? So it's backwards from what I would intuitively think. So I put that on there because I thought it was interesting, but again, I don't know a whole lot about that. So I just read it. All right, let's talk about neurons. Let's break it down in a little deeper. Have you heard that we only use 10% of our brain? They made a whole movie about that with, what's her name? Salma Hayek. Oh my God. Scarlett Johansson. Sorry. Black Widow. Yeah. She made a movie called, I think, Lucy. Morgan Freeman in it also. And it was based on this premise that we use 10% of our brain, but scientists figured out how to use 20% and then 30% and then 50%. And then throughout the movie, she's gaining more and more powers and ends up becoming kind of like a god. So it's a fun thing for Hollywood to play around with. It's absolutely just crap. Nothing about it is true. We use much more than 10% of your brain, unless you're blonde, and then you really do only use 10%. I'm just kidding. Look, that's highlighted here. I'm kidding. Don't get mad. Don't go complain, because I'm absolutely kidding. The brain uses about 20% of your entire body's energy reserves. Now, your brain is not 1/5 of your entire body. And if your entire body is requiring energy, it's weird that a fifth of your body, a fifth of your energy reserves are being utilized by a far smaller percentage of tissue, which is your brain, right? So it wouldn't make a lot of sense, whether you subscribe to the man in the sky that we're created by God. Why would God design us with this design where we have this brain that requires massive amounts of energy, but we're only using 10% of it? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then if you subscribe to the evolutionary theory and we've evolved, well, then it very much doesn't make any sense, because evolution, by definition, is survival of the fittest, and why that just wouldn't work, right? Over time, we would have evolved that into be a much more efficient mechanism than what we currently have, right? Which is 20% of our resources being used by this tiny little brain. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense to break down these numbers. So where did this come from? Well, it came from sort of a misconstrued understanding of how the brain works. So right now, I have this light on, and that's the only light in my house that's on right now. So is it fair to say that I have this, 2,600 square foot house, however big it is, and I only use 10% of the lights? Well, sure. Right now, that is a true statement, because every other light in the house is off. At any given time, there are probably not more than 1 or 2 lights in my house going at a time. If I'm in that room and I'm going to that room and I'm going back and forth, those 2 lights might be on. But for the most part, I try to keep the lights off. Now, there are days where if I'm running all over the house doing different stuff, I don't turn off the light on and on every time I'm entering and exiting a room if I'm up and running around. So every light might be on. So in that particular moment, 100% is being utilized at one time, right? But we like to try to be efficient, right? We like to save money, and our brain is the same way. Your brain is very lazy, believe it or not. Even though it uses a lot of energy, it tries not to. So if there's a part of your brain that's not being used because there's no stimulus for that, there's no need for that to be used, it's sort of shutting down to some extent. So we're not seeing electrical activity occur there. So we're using whatever task we're focused on, those parts of your brain light up, those parts of your brain work, and they're the parts that are getting the attention. So we say, oh, you're only using 10% of your brain. And most of the time we're only doing one thing at a time, so we're only using 10% at a time. But that's not really a full picture of what happens, because even simple tasks show electrical activity in all parts of your brain. It's just not very much activity because it's not required. So that's kind of where that comes from, but we do actually use 100% of our brain. All right. There's two last parts of this chapter. One is about neurons, and there is quite a bit here, but I'm going to try to go through this a little quicker. And then the last part is about medications and kind of how they work. I cover that a little bit more detailed because I think it's important to understand how that works, and I'll explain why when we get there. All right, more stuff. Neurons. This is two neurons, okay? This one connected here, talking to this one. So this is two. We have a few more than that. All right, so nomenclature here. These little spiky things that look like tree branches, these are called dendrites. By the way, you will probably see more of these definitions than the brain stuff because these are pretty cut and dry. A dendrite's a dendrite, an axon's an axon. I mean, they stand apart. They're very different. There's not a lot of overlap like some of the other brain stuff. So I tend to test more on the neurons part than the brain part, just FYI. So dendrites are these tree branch looking things. This entire piece here is called the cell body. This little piece here, the purple part, is a nucleus. This long arm that comes off here is called an axon, okay? At the end of the axon, you have more dendrites. Now, the axon in this picture, one more thing here, see these little like balls, these little white, it looks like beads or whatever? These are little balls of fat, basically, and it's called the myelin sheath. Now, what is going on here? Well, we have chemicals in here that are being triggered through electrical stimulus to release particular neurotransmitters. And what happens is it sends an measurable electric signal down the axon, and that signal is called an action potential. Okay, that's on another slide. So we have electrical stimulus, a releasing of specific neurochemicals that come down as an action potential down the axon, and they travel to the end here, right, which is called the synapse. Now the synapse, I think there's another, so here's that same picture right here on the side, right? So we have the action potential that comes down here, and this is the end of that dendrite. Now, this is zoomed in, obviously, super, super close. And the reason that this is showing you this is because they don't actually touch. All right? If you watch the video of the brain video, the crash course video, he says it's the tiniest little game of I'm not touching you in history, right? Remember like when you'd sit in the back car and you'd be like, don't touch me. And so you just put your finger like right here and be super annoying. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. That's what this is doing. All right, so why is it doing that? Well, I don't know a whole lot about electricity, but I know this. If I'm standing in a puddle and I touch an electric wire, I'm going to have a different hairdo pretty soon, right? So that's not a good thing. So you don't ever want to be grounded, right, when you're touching electrical things, because then why are there people in my driveway? I think that's lawn people for next door, but why are they in my driveway? You know what they're going to do? They're going to leaf blow the neighbor's stuff into my driveway, and I'm going to have to go out there and have a word. Sorry. So, what was I saying? Yeah, so you don't want to have all of these little batteries that are throwing out electrical impulses all touching, because your entire brain would then short circuit, because if this one needs to talk to this one, instead of one direct line to get there, it's going to turn on, which is going to light up the entire brain, right? That's no good. So it's important that they not touch. So if they're not touched, how do they get that message across? We'll get there. All right, so this is just what I just said. The neuron is the central nervous system that receives and sends messages. The cell body, I think I've talked about all of this. The axon, the dendrite, the myelin sheath. Don't worry about those glial cells. I'm not going to get into that. That's a little too deep. So yeah, that's just defining all of these things that I just said. All right, how many of these little bad boys are there? So there's 2 of these in this picture, right? Do you think we have like 10, 20? I don't know. Like, what's your guess? We have about 86 billion neurons in our brain. Interestingly, 16.3 billion in the cerebral cortex, 69.5 billion in the cerebellum. Remember the cerebellum? That's this part right here. 69.5 billion just right here. Obviously, there's some communicating going on in here that's pretty vitally important to us living, right? That's why evolution, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's why there's so much more here than there is in the rest of the brain, right? So there's about 90 trillion synapses. Okay, well, how's that? Okay, well, look at this. See how this branches off? This dendrite has 2. This dendrite has 3. So this one neuron can be connected here and here and here and here and here, right? All of these can be a connection. So we can have 80-something billion neurons, but trillions of connections because each one can be connected to multiple other neurons. Now, you won't see a picture like that because it would be too complicated. It would just look like a bowl of spaghetti, and you wouldn't be able to make any sense of it. So they break it down, and they just show you the 2 noodles instead of a whole bowl of spaghetti. But basically, that's what we'd be looking at, is so many neurons that it would just look like a big ball of nothing. So, where was I? So, we have about 86 billion neurons, unless you're blonde, and then you probably only have like 2 or 3. I'm just kidding. I just like picking on blondes. I don't know why. I just do. But I'm totally kidding. Absolutely kidding. Maybe I was heartbroken by a blonde at one time. Anyways. All right, here's the action potential. It's just a cool graphic that I found, so I threw it on here, but it's the same thing that I've talked about. Again, when you take AMP2, for those that have the pleasure of taking that, you will talk about the exact chemical process and electrochemical process that occurs. You'll talk about how there's positive and negative charges between this and that, and how it releases particular molecules, and the molecules are attracted here because they're positively charged, and these are, I mean, you get into like the really, literally, like atomic, what's going on a subatomic level. I mean, it gets super, super detailed, so thank God we don't have to go over that. But one of the things that I did mention, the reason that we have these myelin sheaths, these little balls of fat, is because fat is filled with a lot of water. As you know, and what I started to say earlier and I didn't finish, water is a great conductor for electricity. So when we're sending an electrical current, right, if we sent it on this one with no myelinated sheathing, it would get there. It would go from here to here, whatever. But in this one, if I have these little myelinated sheaths of fat, whenever I'm sending that electrical activity, it allows this to travel much more efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean a stronger signal, which is faster and better received. So, one of the things that occurs over time, sometimes, is these myelinated sheaths wear out, they dissolve, they go away, we become more like this, and so our thinking slows down. Our thinking is much faster whenever we're young, and this is, all the wiring is fresh and new. As you get older, these things dissolve, go away, your thinking slows down quite a bit. And obviously, if you've got elderly people in your life, you'll probably recognize that's occurred. So now there's some things that might prevent that. People that use their brain, people that work, college professors that work when they're 80, 90 years old, grandmas that do Sudoku puzzles and crossword puzzles, and they're really challenging their brain. They tend to last longer, and they'll have a little more snap to them at an older age. Right? It's just like anything else. If you don't use it, you lose it. If you do use it, tends to last a little longer. All right, I already talked about all these. I think action potential is that electrical signal. You'll see that again. The neural synapse is that point where they don't quite touch. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. I'm going to get to those. Receptors, I'm going to get to that in a second. And reuptake. Okay, I think I already talked about that. So let's break this down a little bit. I'm going to make this bigger because I want to be able to see it. So nobody needs to see me anyway. I'm ugly. All right, so hopefully you can see that. And it's, I wish this picture was a little clearer. It's a little fuzzy even on my screen. So we have an action potential that arrives, right? Cell body's up here somewhere, right? And says, hey, we need to send a message. So it comes down here, and you have all of these vesicles in here, right? Now these vesicles are these little like circular protective bubbles, and inside those bubbles we have neurotransmitters, okay? These individual little brown balls are neurotransmitters. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, but they're chemical messengers. And different neurotransmitters send different messages. Some send messages that, hey, I'm happy. That's dopamine. Some send messages, hey, I'm sleepy. That's, actually, I think there's a list of them. Yeah, here we go. So we have dopamine, which is involved in movement planning, and mostly it's known for its reward, right? So whenever you do most drugs and you feel high, then that is a release of dopamine in your system that gives you this feeling of pleasure. That's why they call it doing dope, because you're doing dopamine. You're naturally making your body release dopamine. Dopamine is also released from laughing. It's also released from sex, particularly from orgasm. So we have that going. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that is most closely associated with mood. So most of our mood drugs are serotonin inhibitors. So there's something called SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they prevent serotonin from being retaken back in, and I'll explain that in a second. But most of our medications that involve moods are serotonin-based. They're looking at that mechanism. Glutamate, GABA, ACH, you don't really need to know those, so don't really worry about those. Then here's this last one. Again, there's tons of information here. Don't worry about all that information. I'm just putting it there because there's always going to be a nurse nerd in the class that wants to know. So here you go. That's for you, but don't spend a lot of time studying that. That's not going to be on the exam. So that's what neurotransmitters are. There's different ones. They do different things. They send different messages. So what happens is the action potential comes down here. It hits these vesicles. The specific one that has that particular neurotransmitter in it, right, will then travel here to this wall. It will fuse together with this plasma membrane. The plasma membrane opens up and it dumps out the chemical message in the synapse. Now this is filled with like, cerebral fluid, brain fluid, basically. God, I can't think of the name of it now. Anyway, so these float across, and this is the next neuron, and here we have these ion channels, right? These ion channels are the receiving channels, and what happens is when they sense these chemicals, they open up. Now, interestingly, we don't just send one message at a time, right? We have maybe a couple of these occurring, different chemicals all mixed in this little synapse. These ion channels are specifically tuned to this particular neurotransmitter. So this will only open up for this receptor site will only open up for its particular neurotransmitter. So if serotonin is coming out and this is not a serotonin receptor site, it will pass it right by. It won't open. If this is a serotonin receptor site, it will open, and this will now plug in here and come through. Again, in AMP2, you go into a lot more detail about this, so this is a very quick overview, and it's, in fact, not even 1,000% accurate, but it's pretty close. So, action potential comes down, hits these vesicles, vesicles come down, they open up, they go across this synaptic gap, or synaptic cleft, or just synapse. It's all the same thing. It's just different terminology. It releases the message and it comes across here. So, why is it that people don't take medicine? Let's talk about that for a second. And that's why I cover this with this much detail. I don't know how many times when I was a police officer and I was in patrol, I was a crisis intervention officer. Crisis intervention officer gets called to any call that involves mental illness. Here, I guess I can minimize that a little bit. All right, so we would get to these calls and we would get to know all the people that were in our areas that would be like, well, Johnny's not on his medication again. And you're like, okay, well, what's he up to? What's he doing? And they would tell you, and sometimes it's criminal, sometimes it's not, and you have to deal with it sometimes, and sometimes you don't. But, the family's always said the same thing. I just don't understand why he doesn't take that medicine. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. And the other thing that I've heard that people don't understand is they feel maybe depressed. They go to their doctor, they get put on an antidepressant, and they take it for 2-3 weeks, and it doesn't work. And so they just stop taking it. And they're like, yep, those don't work for me. Yes, they do. That one didn't work for you. Try another one. Or they'll say, I went and my doctor said, oh, it didn't work. I'm going to double the dose. He doesn't even know what he's doing. Well, that's true. He doesn't know what he's doing because we're talking about something that's so small it can't even be seen on a microscope. Okay? This is all basically theory-driven but proven with anecdotal research. Okay, we can't see this stuff. We're talking atoms. Okay, we're talking molecules so small that they can be detected in certain tests can detect the presence or absence of them, but we can't see individual ones. We can't see this mechanism going on. So what happens is there's all of these building blocks, right? These building blocks come together and they form these neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters come together and these vesicles that then are basically there for storage until they need to be used. Now, this happens at a certain rate. These get built and stored at a certain rate. If they are being built faster than they are being used, then we have a surplus and we don't have room for that. That's no good. So nature has created this system where we have enzymes that come in and they destroy this plasma membrane, and these will then dissolve back to their basic parts and they can be utilized again. Now this is like Legos, right? We can build a car and we can build an airplane, right? And we have those two things separate and distinct. But if we don't need a lot of cars, then this breaks down those Legos, and those same Legos that we used to build cars with, now we can build an airplane, right? So it's a very efficient way for our body to take the molecules that we have in storage and build what we think we're going to need, but if we build too much, then we just break it apart and build something else with it, okay? Serotonin, GABA, ACH, whatever it is. Now, there's all different ways that this system can be broken. Maybe we don't have enough of these parts. Maybe we need more Legos. Maybe these things come together and they create this vesicle, but maybe we have too many enzymes. Our body is just producing too many of these destructive enzymes that break these down, and our body doesn't get a chance to use it. We have a deficit. Even though we're building the right amount, we can't store them long enough. We need to do something about that enzyme. Let's see, maybe, okay, so then we talk about the communication side of thing, right? So these come across here and they lock in to this receptor, they get used, and then they kind of break off and float back in here and go away. Maybe there's a problem with this mechanism. So maybe we could plug up with a drug these receptor sites, and instead of them coming out, going straight across and not really being used, maybe they come out and they stay. This is in our system. This is in our brain fluids, remember? So we need stuff in here, right? Our body's using that. So if we have serotonin in here, that is a good thing. If we don't, that is not a good thing. So maybe we block these receptor sites so that when serotonin gets released into the synaptic cleft, it's being blocked by the drug, so it can't go back in, right? It has to stay here and do its job. It's like, think of like a little army soldier, right? That's on Normandy, but he's not going to go do his job. He comes out, sees what's going on. He's like, nope, don't like it out here. Wants to go right back in. No, can't do that, right? You go out, it's now blocked through Prozac or some other prescription med, And so now it kind of has to stay out here and do its job. So that would be an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That's what this is. It's preventing the reuptake. It's inhibiting, I guess I should say, the reuptake. So doctors will give you a pill that falls into the most common class, which is SSRI, that deals with serotonin. If it doesn't work, okay, we'll give you more, right? We're going to start you off with the safest doses possible, right? We don't want you, because over time you're going to build a tolerance, and we're going to have to increase the dosage. So I don't want to start you at a high dosage unless I absolutely have to. So I'm going to start you on a low dosage. That just makes sense. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, then we don't know if it's because there's not enough drug or if it's the wrong kind of drug. So we have to up your dosage. So I'm going to up your dosage, and then we're going to see if it works. No, it didn't work then. Now we can eliminate that, right? We can do a differential diagnosis on that, and we can say, that's not the mechanism that's broken. I gave you a medicine, like, for instance, drug blocks the synthesis of neurotransmitter molecules. Okay, so it blocks things from going from this to this, if you needed that. Maybe we up the dosage and we don't see any change, and we can say, the drug that we had that was doing this didn't do anything, so this is not broken. So I'm going to get you off of an SSRI, and I'm going to give you an SNRI. That's a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. It does something mechanically entirely different. And then there's something called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAO inhibitors. Those have a lot more side effects. Doctors don't like prescribing them. You can't drink alcohol at all when you're on them, so boo. So then there's those. There's, what am I missing? Anyways, this is the reason that that doctors rather, prescribe different medicines in different classes and all that. And it kind of maybe seems like they don't know what they're doing. And the reason is they kind of don't. It is a little bit of a guessing game. And you kind of have to play around with it until you get it kind of figured out. And then the reason people don't take their medicine is because, well, one, you take a cold medicine and your symptoms go away. So what do? Stop taking the cold medicine, right? You have a headache, you pop some Aleve, your headache goes away, right? Do you keep taking Aleve? No. So we're kind of used to taking medicine until the problem goes away, and then we discontinue the medicine. Well, when you're on medicine that corrects brain chemistry, you don't correct it permanently. This is a Band-Aid. It's not a cure. So a lot of times consumers of mental health will take pills. They'll get better. Their symptoms alleviate. They're no longer depressed, or they're not having hallucinations or whatever it is, because the medicine worked, and then they stop taking it. Well, guess what? Those symptoms are going to come back. Okay, you're not staving off a headache. I mean, this is the way your brain chemistry is. You have a chemical imbalance. There's no harm in that. There's no shame in that. That's naturally what's going on with you. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is the side effects, because these medicines are pretty powerful. Side effects are pretty extreme. So sometimes the side effects people feel are worse than the symptoms that they were experiencing. So I think going backwards here, I think I covered all of that and that and that and that. All right. So that's chapter 3. By the way, I don't want you to feel like, because I'm putting these videos out pretty quickly, I don't want you to feel like you have to keep up with them at my pace. Our first test is like September 17th, I think. So, we got some time. I'm just trying to, anytime I find a quick hour that I have to make one of these, I'm trying to get it knocked out. So, anyway, we got one more of these, and then you should have all the information that you need for the first exam, which again will be on the 17th. It'll be multiple choice. I don't know how many questions because I haven't written it yet. And just so you know, side note about my exams, I write all of my exams. I don't use any test banks. So you won't be able to cut and paste things and get things off of study.com or Quizlet or any of those kinds of things. So it's just not going to happen. I do tend to use a lot of, I want to say scenarios, because they're more fun to write. I just don't like boring, right out of the textbook, right off the slide kind of stuff. I just think that sucks. So if I said, little Johnny got hit in the back of the head with a baseball bat and now he can't see, that's probably because he has damage to his which lobe? You'll see questions like that. It won't be the blank lobe is controlling the function of the brain. I won't talk like that, and I talk like I do now on tests. So just so you know kind of what to expect. But I'll have a whole review, and we'll talk more about that later. So without further ado, I'm cutting this off, and I'm going to sleep. Y'all have a good one. Did I hit the right button? All right, am I off? I don't know if that turned off. Shift, Command, Control, Command, Escape. Control, Command. Now I got it.